Good afternoon. Apologies for the delay. It wouldn't be a webinar without some technical difficulties. So thank you all for your patience. I'm Christina Riley. We're going to kick it off here in just a second. Looks like we've got quite a few in attendance. Might make sense to just give it a minute or two, let a few more folks log on. All right, I think that to be kind of everybody's time, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all. There's quite a few of the names I recognize that have been a part of this process since the beginning. So we appreciate your continued devotion to the STEPS mission. We'll go ahead and dive into the recommendations and give an overview as to what the team has done to lead into this. We do have the slide deck as well as the report available to download. So if you need any assistance with that, we have a great team here. Christina Rupp is kind of leading our technical side. So if you need any assistance with that, feel free to put into the question box and she can help you to do that. But we'll go ahead and get kicked off. Pretty tight agenda. So we're going to go ahead and get started. All righty. So this is first and foremost our team. Unfortunately, today we're missing one of our team members. Jage came down with stomach bug like most folks right now. So unfortunately, he will not be able to join us. So as an introduction, myself, Christina Riley, I'm the lead of the project and run a consulting business working mostly in two areas. One is registered apprenticeship, which I love as a graduate of registered apprenticeship, and also working with the tribes as a tribal liaison. So Joseph, do you want to give a brief introduction to yourself as well?
Hello, everybody. Joe Hout, and I'm very pleased to be working with Christina Riley and Christina Rupp, Peter Guzman, and unfortunately, Jage, who wasn't able to join us today. I have worked as a consultant in apprenticeship and workforce development in a lot of different capacities, and this project under Peter's leadership has been a really great opportunity to look at apprenticeship expansion and, most importantly, how best to integrate apprenticeship across the workforce sectors and with the community and technical colleges. So thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. And Jage has a background in diversity and equity, so he was a great addition to this team. So I'll do my best to fill in on his notes that he left for us today, but probably will miss the mark a little bit to what he could offer to the team. All right, so our host, thank you, Christina. Will you please introduce yourself? Although I have a feeling most everyone knows you.
Thank you, Christina. It's always a pleasure to be paired up with another Christina any day of the week. So first and foremost, welcome everyone. I'm thrilled to represent the Washington State Construction Center of Excellence, also known as the CCE, which is a vital convening hub that unites business, apprenticeship systems, government, and the K-20 education system to strengthen Washington's construction industry. At the heart of the CCE's mission is workforce development, removing barriers to apprenticeships and fostering a skilled and diverse workforce. We're very proud to host this seminar for you today. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you so much. And we are so very fortunate to have Peter Guzman here today. Peter, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, Peter Guzman, Apprenticeship Program Manager for the Department of Labor and Industries. I am very excited about being here to promote and publicize this great report that was put together by Christina and the team, representing over 20,000 registered apprentices in our state and growing. Very excited about seeing how we can provide this information to you all today and continue to sustain and expand registered apprenticeship. So great and glad to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. And Peter, if you'd give an overview, get us started.
Yeah, so as the sponsor here of this project, it's really the work of us having received a Department of Labor a grant for expansion of apprenticeship, and specifically what I have been very close to and supportive of in terms of the objective is system alignment. And what I mean system alignment, it's about the various agencies, partners, stakeholders that comprise the registered apprenticeship ecosystem and all of its many support partners. And so we're going to hear about that system alignment and other recommendations. Also, the objective consisted of some, meaningful data. What type of data is out there that can be used to support either resources or policy or practice realignment? And then finally, best practices. What best practices can we come away with at the end of this presentation that we can put into action when we leave here today? So I'm very proud to be here and looking forward to the great work that Christina and her team have done.
Thank you. Oh, some of my slides are missing, but that's okay. So I can cover the information that's not popping up on the screen. So basically, to explain, how did we come about this information? So we created a plan and we decided to do listening and learning sessions. So we kicked off our first session in January of this year, and we partnered with the Washington State Apprenticeship Training Council's meeting so that we could get as many stakeholders to the table to begin with and really encourage as much participation as we can. Because if we didn't get a lot of participation, then we felt like the information, that data that Peter's talking about, really wouldn't be very emallaborate and it wouldn't be helpful. So we kicked this off and invited any and all stakeholders. We utilized the very vast apprenticeship listserv that Washington State has, and over 4,000 people were invited to this initial kickoff meeting. We also utilized our network to ensure that we were getting all communities so that it was well represented. So that first kickoff meeting was held in the Tumwater office there in January. And from there, we decided to break it apart. So we thought it was really important to separate the stakeholders based on who they serve and kind of which bucket they were in. So that second meeting we held with just our workforce development partners. We included the tribes within that as well with their workforce development sections. And so that we could really hear as those partners what is working in system integration and kind of where they were tripping up and building those relationships or being able to move the needle. So that was really a good tactic, because it's a lot easier to talk about kind of the weaknesses when you're just, within your own network. So we did that. From there in March, we met with the apprenticeship programs. So we invited the different registered apprenticeship programs, as well as our pre-apprenticeship programs or preparation programs, any sort of affiliations, whether that be the unions, the state building trades, the labor councils, those organizations that work with apprentices, work to recruit and who, you know, is the important piece of this. How do they work with the partners? So we held a listening session, and it was very well received and well attended. We appreciated all the thorough feedback that we got. We were able to understand where the programs are having their own issues and understand how these partners do or do not understand the other partners within the system integration team that we were trying to build here. So from there, we continued to meet separately, and we reached out to our education sector. So we met with our community and technical colleges, our K through 12 partners, the CCW folks, and we're able to understand their side of the table around system integration with registered apprenticeship. Our fourth meeting we held with our East Side partners to ensure that we were getting the voices of the entire state. And then trying to think who our fifth meeting was. I'm forgetting somebody. My slide deck isn't here. So Joe, what am I forgetting?
The Eastern Washington. Did you
Yep.
mention those? Yep.
Yeah.
And then
yeah. And then our last one, we wrapped up again with the Washington State Apprenticeship Council. We held our final listening session with all the partners again. And the intention of that last meeting was to make sure that what we heard, we shared back, and to see if there was any input and if we got anything wrong. So that was the system and the way that we gathered this information. We did a lot of one-on-one interviews with folks that had a lot of information to share in each and every one of those sectors, so that we could ask some more thorough questions and to dive a little bit deeper into the information that we heard. And we also sent out surveys to, you know, kind of glean just as much information from this giving group that we could. And we were really appreciative of the feedback that we received. So let's see. Okay. So I think from there, we did a great job of compiling this information. And what we were able to diagnose was there were certain buckets that were really relevant that we heard throughout this. And that was the ability to identify the access points of apprenticeship, whether that's for the applicants or for the partners trying to get folks into apprenticeship. As well as understanding this communication issues that are aligned. And so we have a lot of information around kind of that breakdown and where those hiccups are, and some recommendations to move that needle forward as well. And then understanding the diversity and equity points of interest. And a lot of that is based around are we getting into any and all communities in Washington? Are we reaching the diversity that we have? And are we removing barriers to make sure that that access is there? So one of the main buckets is, how do people get into apprenticeship, right? And this is something that we hear from our community partners. And it's very, you know, it's a very robust system. There's over 150 different programs, and each program has their own requirements to get into apprenticeship. They have their own time frame as to when you can apply, what the application process looks like. Do you have to bring a bunch of paperwork, or is it online? And really what we heard from our stakeholders is it's too complicated. It's too complicated. It's too complicated for the partners, and it's far too complicated for the applicants. If you're trying to cast a wide net. We also heard that, you know, it's not necessarily economic for all communities to be able to apply for apprenticeship programs. Many of our programs are statewide, and the application is in an area that is far. And so you're expecting to drive a great distance in the hopes that you can apply for something. And that's not something that everybody is able to do. And it certainly creates a barrier all within itself. And so, you know, as we really broke this down, we realized that the application process alone for apprenticeship is really an area where we need some deep review to be able to kind of break down those barriers and make it much easier and accessible to everyone. So, is there anything that I've left out, Joe? I see you came off mute.
No, I think, yeah, just, it's good.
Okay, perfect. So as we were continuing to hear these sessions, what we really started wasn't in our thoughts as we had built out this plan, but what we heard is it wasn't so much about outreach and getting people to come to these programs or to come to these events, but it was figuring out a way to keep the participants in the apprenticeship programs or the preparation programs. So retention became a very big piece of this. And so we had to really kind of break that into the plan and figure out what can we do here. And I know, Peter, you'll kind of get into some stuff that LNI is already doing to capture that. So this work just is able to, add to that. But we needed to take a deep dive into why participants were leaving apprenticeship programs. And so we were able to look at some data and, there's not a lot of data yet around that, but there are some programs that capture this data that if an apprentice just doesn't show up anymore, isn't communicating, isn't taking classes, they capture, they try to reach out to that apprentice and figure out why. And if folks call in and say, hey, I don't want to be an apprentice anymore, or the folks that are let go. So we took a great review of that information and determined, why are people leaving apprenticeship? Is it just folks who are just now entering into apprenticeship? It's their beginning stage, or is there a large number of folks that are leaving after they've devoted quite a few years to it? And unfortunately, the information is all of the above. It's a good mixture of all of that. And so, one of the things that we really were hoping is, man, what if all of the programs did this exit interview and figured out why people were leaving? Then we could really make some changes, right? So we'll get a little deeper into that. As we discussed, there's a lot of information that we found within the equity and diversity bucket. And there's quite a few slides to go into that information so that you can see it very closely. Sorry about that. But what we didn't expect was that there would be so much information within this study that would point to areas where we could grow and improve our programs in that area. So we'll get to the slides that are specific to that.
I think just to mention one other thing related to the retention piece, the data are few and far between programs, but one of the trends that we certainly saw is that apprenticeship programs struggle with that too. If they had the staffing to do more intensive advising, to make sure that first year apprentices are doing okay, not only in terms of what they're doing on the job, but are they getting the mentorship they need? And are they actually being understood in terms of how well they're doing in terms of their classwork and making it through the program as a whole? So it's partly a resource question, but also going across all the different trades, coming up with some standard approaches, if you will, and the resources behind it to help better understand how to retain apprentices longer in the programs. And that's a really important piece for people to move on into more advanced roles and positions.
Yeah, I appreciate that you said that. And the only other thing too, I would say is the information that we got was really just kind of the top. There was a lot of additional questions when it said that, folks left because the training was too hard. Well, what aspect of training was too hard? Was it the classroom instruction? Was it math? Was there a tutor that was needed, or was it a physical aspect of the training? So there's a lot of preliminary information that we were able to get, but I think that it was very clear that putting a more robust questionnaire together for all of the programs would be very beneficial for us to be able to understand where these barriers are. So as we mentioned, point of entry and access is super difficult for folks to navigate, whether we're talking about an employment center a high school counselor or somebody looking to enter an apprenticeship on their own, nobody knows where to start. And the most success is if you know somebody directly and they can lead you to where you need to go. So that handoff right now is very important. So, you know, that was probably the loudest point we heard from folks that are not in apprenticeship is how the heck do I get there? So want to make sure that we really emphasize that. The other thing that was very loud is our partnerships. Not nobody, a lot of folks don't understand how our partners can work together. So when we're looking at our workforce development councils and we're looking at registered apprenticeship and then the colleges, they don't know necessarily what one another can provide to each other's organizations, but as well as the apprentices or participants. So having almost a cheat sheet was what we heard people want is, who do I call when I need this? And a great example is if you have an apprentice that's unhoused, right? Where do you call for those services? It's important. You need to be able to help them. And some folks know that information, but it's not widely spread. And if you're outside of that Puget Sound area, it's even more challenging to be able to know where those resources are. So a cheat sheet for that example would be very helpful to the system as a whole. And this one is hard for me. So there's not a single place where all of this knowledge lives, right? Whether that's what apprenticeship programs are available, pre-apprenticeship programs, community-based organizations, all of those things, right? There's a lot of really good websites that have this information, and we found several of them that are in the report. So what would be beneficial is if we all had a common message and sent people to the right place, right? So there's several of these resources and not a lot of people are aware of them. So education, awareness, collaboration, having a one-spot shop to get this information into the hands of people. And we saw a lot of really great marketing material, educational material on registered apprenticeship and preparation programs. But if you didn't know where to go, you weren't going to find it when you put it in the Google search. You really just get the LNI's website, which for those of us that work with an apprenticeship, it can be a good website. But for those looking to get into apprenticeship, it can be pretty clunky and hard to use, especially when you're talking about young folks. So that was something that I think we need a lot of emphasis on is having that one stop. Joe, did you want to jump in here?
Well, one of the ideas that just came up in the chat was that the Washington State Apprenticeship Council could provide a really good third-party objective review of getting the real story of why apprentices leave. And so I think that's a great comment to bring out and say getting a third-party objective perspective and doing that kind of study would be super helpful.
Yeah, and if I can chime in here, maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself in terms of solutions because that's how my brain works. But the intent of this research was really to improve coordination between existing registered apprenticeship programs and the workforce development ecosystem, and especially around system alignment to get information out there for the job seekers to have a roadmap, if you will, on career choice identification, as well as, getting labor market information in terms of, is this a viable career and am I going to make a good living at the end of the day, which for the most part, apprenticeship in our state, for the workforce training report annual earnings, we are number one. I think we're about right now $93,000 per year for those that complete. What the challenge is here is now that there's a lot of excitement around this, a lot of the policymakers, I've been on the ledge hill here the last couple of weeks talking about apprenticeship, and they're trying to get their hands around what is registered apprenticeship and how can we support it. The problem is there isn't a clear understanding of what part of this do we support. Do we support the apprentice? Do we support the apprenticeship program? What about the small businesses, the minority business enterprises? We have large existing union contractors for the most part that constitute the majority of registered apprenticeship, which is about 75–80%. So how do we, the next stage for me is how do we support and provide investments in this system, which is still not yet integrated as we should. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's kind of where I think ultimately we want to go. Great stuff, but then what's the next step? So I'll stop right there before I get the hook.
Oh, that's good. And I think that some of our recommendations answer those questions of how do we integrate, and then what other steps do we support? And so you are jumping ahead, but that's where we all go, right? We're solution-based people. So barrier removal, and then our partnerships. So, and the reason the partnerships is important is a lot of the funding that we see coming into Washington State is grant funding. So how do we expand apprenticeship? How do we get it into rural Washington? How do we grow youth apprenticeship with all of these issues, these barriers? And so understanding who the partners are, having that relationship prior to having a grant application be due, so that you know how you're actually going to be intentional and build this out in a way that, is something that can continue and not just be for the life of that grant time. So again, in this partnership piece too is important, because we've had a lot of folks retire over the last 5 years. With institutional knowledge leaving with them. We've had a hiccup with COVID where some of that information to folks who were hired into positions during that time, they just don't have that experience. They haven't met people. And so again, there's just a lot of partners who have left their positions or somewhere else, and or they've retired or something else. And so there's just a lot of reintroduction to the partners that needs to take place. And positions have changed on top of it. So you used to call this person for this, and now they're gone and their positions changed and they don't do that anymore, right? So there's just a lot of reintroduction and building and strengthening those ties that we heard would really help the partners. So we've already kind of talked about this in that last slide, so we'll go ahead and move on. Peter, you get to talk about those big items. So this information we knew we would hear, was way outside of what our report was meant to do, but we thought it was important to give it a slide so that the folks that are here can understand why. So the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I know I jumped to solution. Some of the big themes that we have right now in registered apprenticeship is for developing approval of new registered apprenticeship programs, including revisions as part of our regulatory system. So we at L&I are the administrative arm of registered apprenticeship in our state. We have a 7-member regulatory council that meets 4 times a year, and 4 times a year we provide standards of apprenticeship that go before them, and they ultimately are the ones that approve or deny it, and it goes back to the sponsor for further rework. At times, it can be very clunky because of the objection process. So if you have, let's say you have a new underwater basket weaving apprenticeship that wants to get approved, but you have an existing underwater basket weaving program in the neighboring county, that existing program can object, and if they're found to have standing, it takes it to kind of a litigious process where there can be mediation, there can be a hearing, and pending agreement of the differences, it could prolong the approval of the apprenticeship program 3, 6, 9 months, and even up to a year, attorney fees. And what we're doing right now internally through our agency as well as our council is trying to come up with some mitigating recommendations to help minimize and shorten the objection or clarify the objection process. The legislature is also looking at this. As a matter of fact, I gave a presentation yesterday before one of the House labor committees talking about just the objection process. So they're very interested in seeing ways that we can improve that. Secondly, 50% tuition waiver. Any of you presently that partner, your registered apprenticeship program that partners with a community or technical college, the colleges have the ability for students to charge tuition, right, based on whether you're resident or non-resident, other factors. Per WAC, per statute, you can charge 50% tuition for that apprentice, which means that there's less resources to support the apprenticeship training program, which can take on various different partnerships. Those of you that might be familiar with South Seattle Community College in Georgetown, there's a lot of apprenticeship programs there, and they're on the facilities. There's different relationships in terms of who does the instruction, who pays for the material, the equipment, the facilities. And when you only take in 50% of the tuition, it means that there's less money to go out there. So there are some possible, well, there's been a lot of discussion, maybe some legislation on how to fully fund that tuition so we can continue to expand apprenticeship. And then the last one here that I'll talk about is the stigma around apprenticeship, that, oh, apprenticeships are only for labor unions. They're only for building and construction trades. You have to know someone to get in. And I'm sure a lot of this, maybe Christina and her team heard about, it's not for women, it's not for minorities, and it's not for small business. So those are not accurate, but yes, have there been some challenges in those areas? Absolutely. So part of our recommendation is to, have better information around registered apprenticeship. I mean, right now in our agency, through legislation, we are setting up what's called industry sector platforms as kind of a meeting place for innovation, collaboration, to get more discussion around apprenticeship, new apprenticeship, especially non-traditional, BIPOC populations, small businesses, minority businesses, rural businesses, and really to try to, destigmatize the fact that apprenticeship can be for everybody. But it's got to fit this box. I'm not going to say it's not. We do have a regulatory council, and they will not approve anything unless it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck. Hopefully no one's a duck out there that's offended. But so these are some challenges that we have here, and part of the recommendations here that Christina's going to talk about will help mitigate some of these. So I will stop right there.
Yeah. And we did have a question about stigma, and it was kind of an interesting topic within our team because we are all so immersed in apprenticeship. We're like, there's no stigma. But the fact of the matter is, when you're talking to parents or you're talking to counselors or you're talking to other partners, apprenticeship is usually the alternative pathway, right? And so making sure that that apprenticeship is represented as a whole, not just a pathway into the blue collar workforce through building and construction trades, but also a pathway into these other great occupations, whether it's in healthcare or a dental office or a vet tech or IT. There's so much more and area to grow within that, right? There's a lot of occupations that could be represented by apprenticeship that are yet not. And so reducing that stigma is certainly a way to do that. And so again, it does exist, and it is an area where we need to continue to work. And I know our partners have done a great job in educating our K through 12 partners. But to Billy's point, we need to market that success, those young folks that get in and are successful and buy their first house by the time they're 22. That's really awesome that they're able to do that through apprenticeship.
I think one of the questions that come up around system integration is, one of the participant questions was, what is being done to market apprenticeship as an alternative to college? We should be doing a better job at lifting up these career choices with our youth. And I would say that there's been a lot of discrete efforts and by a lot of really good organizations to do just that. And I think part of the system integration approach is to build some more horsepower, so it's a more cross-cutting integrated messaging that happens. Because right now, I mean, Christina Rupp at the Construction Center of Excellence, I mean, they do Apprenticeship Rocks. And if anyone wants to see a fantastic introduction to apprenticeship, check out the work that the Construction Center of Excellence has done. I mean, kudos to the center for doing that. But the challenge is everyone's doing a lot of toward particular audiences. And I think case in point, I mean, the whole reason we're here is to try to figure out how to build more horsepower around getting common messaging and getting all the players to be making the same messaging together. So I think there's a lot of great work that's currently being done, and the system integration piece is a critical element to add more horsepower to that.
Yeah, and if I can add, because I know this is my next slide here, one more point. So my comments on stigma were more employer facing, that are new entrants into apprenticeship. What Christina and Joe were talking about is the potential job seeker or parent, right? Oh, I don't want to be a blue collar worker. Well, I stated that the Workforce Training Board annual earnings, 93,000 a year. That's more than a lot of teachers and people that have masters may, have in a year. So, but people think it's blue collar, it's degrading, it's not meaningful work. Well, Christina, I'm sure can tell you, well, that's not accurate. So there's stigmas on both ends, right? So it's something that I'm always looking at the apprentice, but also the employer, because they have to hire the apprentice, right? Without the employer, right? It starts with a job. You do not have an apprenticeship program. So I don't think anybody said that yet, but I said it first. So real quickly here, legislation, I don't want to bore you too much with this, and there's a lot more than this, but this is an example of my world and those in apprenticeship. House Bill 1050 is part of an existing series of bills to require apprenticeship utilization on public works construction, which is the bulk of apprenticeship in our state. And historically, it's been for like Department of Transportation. It's now with the community and technical college. It's just pretty much with every agency, public agency that's out there for projects over $1 million. This year, 1050 extended the 15% apprenticeship utilization to municipalities, right? There are over 600 municipalities in our state, mosquito districts, ports, that are now being required to put utilization of apprentices on their project at a 15% level. It says 2 million there, but I think by 28, it's going to go down to 1 million. So this is a driver for apprenticeship. House Bill 1525, that one's a bill that it's still going to get more support to provide resources to apprentices that have need for childcare. And there is Working Connections Childcare. It's an existing program. They can provide you with some benefits, mainly in construction. The time that you need childcare can be 5 a.m. to 11 o'clock at night, especially if you got overtime. There's there's a job that has to be completed. So this has been one of the biggest challenges that we have in apprenticeships, specifically in the building trades. I know that Christina mentioned a survey that is a part of 5600, which I'll move into now. Before I talk about the industry sector platforms, 5600 was very broad, multifaceted in terms of what that did, provided grants for supportive services, for equipment, supplies, and it also provided us with some funding to do a retention survey of apprentices. We've all had anecdotal information about why apprentices do not complete the first year, right? But we haven't had any evidence-based data. And now we have a survey that we are surveying apprentices in their first month, third month, 6th month, and 1 year to see, actually asking questions, how's it going? And, what are your challenges? And we allow them to identify whether it's childcare or food insecurity. We have, I think, about 10, 11 questions. So that is something that we're gathering more intelligence. The industry sector-based platforms, as I mentioned before, that is something that is, if you're familiar with these skill centers, right? Christina Rupp, her Construction Center of Excellence. This is what is happening here at L&I. And we're going to have 8 sectors, which building trades will be one of them because it's so monolithic, licensed and non-licensed. But it's a place, like I said, for collaboration, innovation, where we can get more kind of discussion around, is your apprenticeship right for it before it goes to the Apprenticeship Council, which is, meets 4 times a year and is very regulatory. So L&I is being more intentional in how we go out doing our work, both for the employer, but also for the apprentice. And this activity, thankfully through my partners here and many of you out there, are here to support us in making sure this happens. And systems integration, it's a big part of this. Without systems integration and us working together, this is not going to really bear any fruit unless that happens. So I'll stop right there. And then back to you, Christina.
One of the questions was in emerging industries like healthcare, IT, financial services, where apprenticeship, quote unquote, is a foreign word. How do we incentivize and encourage more employers to participate? And if you look in healthcare, the Workforce Training Board has been working very hard on the LPN apprenticeship pathway. And I've recently been working on a veterinary technician apprenticeship program in Wenatchee. And it's been very successful and challenged, but it's been successful in the sense that the people who are the employees and the people working on the ground, they are all for it. They want to join these apprenticeships. They're going, where are they and how can we access them? But there is institutional pushback. And that is where you have industry associations and others, or educational institutions, frankly, saying that apprenticeship is not a legitimate training model. And I think that's a real challenge because there is a lot of organic support for apprenticeship. There are many people who say, just point me to where I can join an apprenticeship. They believe in the model. They understand mentorship. They understand that apprenticeship is a pathway to higher wages. But there is institutional pushback, and that's where system integration becomes a very important component at those levels to say, we've got to do a better job of recognizing apprenticeship as not a sole model. It's not like we're running around with that nail and our hammer. It's that it complements a lot of other educational models and can be a really powerful addition to more traditional methods of education. I think that's part of the conversations I think Peter is having, and we all should be having with people who may be questioning the value or the rigor of apprenticeship, because when you look at apprenticeship, in Washington State, it's an extremely rigorous training approach. So I'm just saying you got to think about building or addressing resistance to apprenticeship at multiple levels. And that's where the system integration and being more strategic about that comes in.
Yes, and strengthening those partnerships too. So now we need to get into the recommendations. I think we're going a little bit long, which we knew that we would, but it's just such good information. So, these recommendations, we're going to throw at you in 2 different ways. One, we're going to tell you what they are, but then we also have this timeline that we've built together. So some of this is easy to implement, whereas some of it is going to take much more time and effort and money, resources, all of those things. So first and foremost is our entry and access. So, it's really hard to understand who is hiring, how do you apply, where do I get information, how do I take this to my student, my child, and then again, where's this information posted? A lot of our programs do not post in the traditional sense. You're not going to find it in the newspaper. It's probably not going to be on an online platform. So how do you know programs are even accepting applications and that you meet those qualifications? And then the other thing that we really heard was the fact that there's a lot of programs that are statewide programs. They're accepting applications all across the state, but they're not actually able to take apprentices across the state because the majority of the dispatch points or jobs, as Peter pointed out, are really along the I-5 corridor or in some really hot spots, big cities across the state. And so that can be very frustrating too. workforce partners as well as applicants in the high schools who are trying to get folks into apprenticeship and just feel like there's a roadblock. So again, just making all of this information a lot more transparent and a lot more accessible is going to be key in expanding apprenticeship and building those relationships with system integration.
And just to clarify for all the audience members, all of these recommendations are pointed at Peter, who's going to take all of them and find a way for L&I and the Apprenticeship Training Council to implement. So no pressure on Peter.
All right, Joe, this is your slide.
So one of the recommendations is to form an apprenticeship work group and to be more purposeful about bringing the different partners together from the colleges and from the workforce development system, the workforce boards, and establishing some communities of practice statewide with a focus on regional, and so that we're capturing both rural and urban areas. Part of that is to develop and launch an apprenticeship performance plan. And so we, in the report, talk about one in particular, Colorado, but many states have adopted what are apprenticeship strategic or / expansion plans. And right now that's notably lacking in Washington State. This is something that L&I and the Apprenticeship Training Council, with some funding support, could take on to really articulate, which we don't have, developing goals and metrics around expanding apprenticeship into non-traditional apprenticeship areas like healthcare and IT. Some of those things are already going, but we don't really have any numeric targets and a timeline for putting those into place. So one of our strongest recommendations is really to secure some funding, hopefully legislative funding, to bring the partners together, develop some strategic planning metrics with an eye toward apprenticeship expansion, with an eye toward increasing access, with an eye toward breaking down barriers to getting in and staying in apprenticeship programs, and with an eye toward evaluating in a 2, 3, 4 year time span, how well is Washington doing in meeting those goals? So it was one of the things that really struck us when we were doing this research, is that without a performance plan, without an expansion goal, how well is Washington State really doing? I think there's tons of energy. I think we'd all agree that there's a lot of really smart people, hardworking people working on all of this, but let's put it down and make some goals and be able to look back in a few years and report out to the legislature and to the leadership in these respective areas, community colleges, workforce boards, and L&I, how well this is working. So that's.
Yeah. So I just want to add an emphasis to what Joe said on communities of practice. So as mentioned, there's a lot of new people at the table, right? And there's a lot of people trying to pick up the pieces from folks that have left and that knowledge going with them. And, you know, typically as a state, we do things on a statewide approach. Well, we have so many rural communities that they're being served, but not at the full ability that they could and should. And so putting together a more regional communities of practice where you can network, share this information, and team up, collaborate. So not everybody's doing the same work. And then that really eases the burden on some of our smaller programs and organizations that are trying to do this great work. And so just want to put that in is part of that strategic plan is building out those communities of practice by area. Launching that initiative and inviting folks to the table is something that we definitely want to emphasize.
And the regional sectors that Peter mentioned as a part of that legislation is another aspect of that, with the industry focus as well. So there's a lot of opportunity there.
Okay, so I got distracted by this wonderful question. We'll get to your question in just a second, Billy. Moving forward. So again, I want to be intentional about this information with equity and diversity. It's not a matter of having a certain targeted number of people in your program, checking the box. We did it, right? So that's not good enough, and that's not going to retain those different participants. And so we want to make sure that we understand that. And I mentioned the I-5 corridor. So there's a lot of frustration around apprenticeship is offered at high numbers, but really you have to be in a specific area. And that really leaves out a lot of people in our communities, right? And so system integration and expansion of apprenticeship go hand in hand when you're talking about building a diverse and equitable workforce. And so really coming to the table and figuring out how can we locally support registered apprenticeship? How can we locally remove some of those barriers? And there's a lot of work that's being done legislatively to do that, but that is an area where we see a lot of growth. And so, you know, there's ways to be inclusive. Obviously, marketing material should look like everybody that you're trying to incorporate into your programs. Your leadership should look like your community. You know, there needs to be barrier removal, and we have seen a lot of that from our programs. But again, these support services and having that cheat sheet to know who to call to support folks who might have some more barriers, whether it's childcare or transportation, utilities, that sort of thing. So we really need to make sure. Additionally, we're seeing some programs do this, but mentorship matters. We need to be able to train our mentors on how to be great mentors. And so, you know, there is work being done around that. A lot of programs pat you on the back for what you're doing, but there's always room to improve. And so, you know, representative leadership that has taking mentorship matters, what a duo, right? So those are just some really basic things that, you know, we see that could help. But again, it's that collaboration and bringing the opportunities to the communities instead of expecting the communities to go to those opportunities.
I can answer the question that was in chat about what relationship do we have with OSPI? Thank you for asking the question. One of the pieces of legislation, House Bill 1013, was calling out for regional apprenticeship preparation pilots throughout Washington State, utilizing the Educational Services District. So OSPI received some funding that is going to be contracted to some of the ESDs. And we at L&I received, I think, a couple of FTEs to support the expansion of apprenticeship in the high schools as part of their, whether it's their career technical education. And it's really mirroring the Marysville program. For those of you familiar with that program up north, great broad-based partnership. And what they wanted to do is replicate that throughout our state. So that is a beginning point for us to start bringing, as I call it, apprenticeship and shop classes back in the classroom. And I know there have been some challenges with, at least what I've heard anecdotally, with some of the instructors at K through 12, is that, you know, it's not what they were, I guess, accustomed to do. More academic training is what they were trained for, as opposed to vocational. So there is some paradigm shifts there, but it is something we have a relationship with the OSPI and working with the ESDs to try to expand apprenticeship prep in those districts that eventually lead to apprenticeship. So a lot more coming, but you know, there are going to be some growing pains here, but at least we're making the effort.
Thank you. Okay, so here's our timeline. As stated, I mean, we kind of went over all of these, but there's some really easy to incorporate. For those of you that are watching and have relationships with apprenticeship programs, we will be doing a similar webinar in January that is really focused on what we heard that apprenticeship programs can implement, that they can put into their day-to-day structure and really start to incorporate this to make differences within what they're doing. But as an overview, we've got, you know, again, make it easy, make it simple, provide a short infographic that explains and markets what apprenticeship is as a whole and links to that great one place website that can lead folks into apprenticeship. And again, a focus on rural access to increase opportunities. So those communities of practice come in there, hosting quarterly webinars. And so what we intended with this recommendation is to bring the stakeholders for system integration, so all of those different buckets, to come together and learn from one another as to how they can be working together, and to also collaborate, whether it's on a big project, it's a grant that's coming up, whatever that might look like, so that it's not that shotgun reaction moving forward. So being intentional partners and growing those relationships. So we felt that those quarterly webinars could be utilized to educate each other. Okay, so developing an apprenticeship guidance document for both apprenticeship consultants and potential programs within development. And this just kind of cuts out a lot of the legwork and makes sure that all of the information being dispersed within the state is the same. And it's kind of the idea that here's this catalog, right, or this link, and it shows you, you know, what programs already exist. What do you need? What is RSI? You know, what is OJT? And it really explains it thoroughly so that it's not taking up so much time of the consultants, and it allows them to do things in other ways. And again, that information is the same no matter where you're at within the state. And then we already touched on the building of regional communities of practice. Okay, and then so now we're getting into the things that might take a little bit more time to develop, and that is providing a clear process of how to get into apprenticeship in order to reduce those barriers into entry, targeted advertising. So I know that we've seen a question in the chat, and so, you know, making sure that the marketing material is as it should be, so that, you know, we all know that if you can't see yourself within that program, you're probably not going to apply. So making sure that that marketing is inclusive to all folks within the communities of Washington State. Continue to launch that Mentorship Matters programming. Like I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of programs use it, but maybe there's room to require it. And long-term, establishing leadership that is representative to the communities. Implementing an effective complaint process. This was kind of brought up earlier as well. Some programs do have an effective complaint process, but that cannot be said for everybody. So, you know, having a good set of rules around that and a process where if there's issues, it is something that somebody feels comfortable to do. Again, that's that part of that retention piece. So it's an important exit interviews. I think that, you know, the survey that goes out is a great piece of that. But if we could encourage every program to develop their own exit interviews and require to some extent that they follow up with somebody who just disappears, we'll be able to resolve some of those reasons, potential barriers. And Joe already hit on this. If you want anything you want to add to it, Joe? Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, the only thing, I mean, just to emphasize again, modeling on what other states have done by laying out and addressing many of these same factors. It's not just about increasing the numbers, it's about increasing the quality and delivery. And I think that's a real achievable goal. Sometimes you say to people strategic plan and their eyes glaze over, but it's more of a performance plan. It's more of an expansion plan, and doing it and expanding correctly, not only in terms of the building trades and the traditional apprenticeships, but also the non-traditional apprenticeships in new areas like healthcare, like IT. So many different possibilities. And I think in capturing that in a long-term plan, I think will help everybody better understand their roles and their opportunities.
Yeah, and we have a huge workforce shortage, and apprenticeship is definitely one of the areas that we can work to resolve that. And so with these recommendations, I think Washington State can really see themselves in a position to be prepared to, the silver tsunami continues. And so development of new occupations and the growth that we see in Washington, we need to be able to support that. And we definitely believe that apprenticeship is a pathway to that. So again, we want to thank Christina for hosting this event. We hope that it was helpful to you. There is access to the full report. If you have any information that you would like to ask further questions on, please feel free to reach out to our team. We were hoping to leave a little bit more time for Q&A, but there's just too much information. So we have hit the time limit. We'll stop recording, and if there are any questions, we are happy to take those before we log off. But want to thank the team and thank Christina for meeting today and sharing this amazing information with everybody that was able to participate.
Thank you again, Christina and Peter and Joseph and an Iljej, so he couldn't be here. It was a pleasure to host this for you. We're hosting a follow-up session to basically apprenticeship programs and others who support apprenticeship programs, apprenticeship prep and CTE in January on the 10th at 11 a.m. And we'll be sending out an invitation shortly to that on Zoom events.
Yeah, and just a final word for me. I want to thank Christina and her team. I mean, what we did here was put in a request for proposal, and she responded and was the awardee. So it's really the work of her team, and it's also a passion of mine. So thank you for continuing that passion. And it won't be the end of this conversation. It's really just the beginning. So thank you all.
Yeah, and thanks to all the participants. If there are any ledge staffers out there, if you need any help finding any information that'll help you advance this, let us know.